From JBS Studios in Greater New York, this is the JBS News Update with Teisha Bader.
I'm Teisha Bader with the JBS News Update for Wednesday, March the 27th, 2024. As intense fighting continues in Gaza between Israeli troops and terror group Hamas, the IDF announced the death today of 21-year-old Staff Sergeant Nissim Kahalon, killed in battle in Gaza. Israeli troops continue their ground operation in Gaza, eliminating terrorists and destroying terror infrastructure, including terror tunnels. The IDF also said yesterday that it was able to confirm that the deputy head of Hamas's military wing and the head of its administrative and combat support staff were in fact eliminated in an earlier targeted strike. The IDF said responsible for planning the October 7th massacre, these two senior terrorist operatives were eliminated in a precise Israel Air Force strike. An Israeli civilian was killed this morning in a barrage of rockets fired at northern Israel by terror group Hezbollah. The Times of Israel reports that 25-year-old Shahar Azani, a resident of the Druze town of Ein Kiniyeh, was killed when a Hezbollah rocket hit an industrial building in Kiryat Shmona. The IDF responded, hitting terror targets in Lebanon. Hezbollah had said that the attack on Kiryat Shmona was a response to an Israeli airstrike overnight in southern Lebanon, the IDF saying that airstrike was on a terror target, taking out a significant terrorist and other terror operatives who had planned an infiltration attack on the border. And follows earlier barrages of some 50 rockets, the IDF said, fired at northern Israel from Lebanon. Well, an Israeli hostage kidnapped by Hamas terrorists from the Nova Music Festival on October the 7th was said to have been murdered by Hamas in captivity. The Tikva Forum for Families of Hostages announced the death in Gaza of 35-year-old Uriel Baruch yesterday, writing that the IDF informed his family that his body is being held in Gaza by Hamas. The status of talks, meanwhile, between Hamas and Israel to reach an agreement that would see the release of hostages now held captive for 173 days for a pause in fighting, among other conditions, remains unclear. There were reports Monday that Hamas had rejected the U.S.-led compromise agreement. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said in response that Hamas's stance clearly demonstrates its utter disinterest in a negotiated deal and attests to the damage done by the UN Security Council's resolution, referring there to the passage of a resolution at the Council earlier on Monday, which demanded an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for the month of Ramadan, where the U.S. abstained. Although the U.S. administration said the response from Hamas about a possible deal was received prior to the UN vote. In response to the U.S. abstention, Prime Minister Netanyahu canceled a delegation of two top Israeli aides who were scheduled to go to Washington, apparently to discuss the topic of a Rafah operation. The resolution at the Security Council on Monday did also call for the immediate release of the hostages, but it did not explicitly condition the ceasefire on the hostages' release. Netanyahu wrote, regrettably, the United States did not veto the new resolution, which calls for a ceasefire that is not contingent on the release of hostages. This, he said, constitutes a clear departure from the consistent U.S. position in the Security Council since the beginning of the war. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield said that while her delegation did not agree with everything in the resolution and therefore was unable to vote in favor of it, it supports some of the critical objectives in this non-binding resolution, saying the Council must make clear that the release of all hostages accompany any ceasefire. Netanyahu told visiting U.S. Senator Rick Scott today that he thought the U.S. decision at the Security Council was a very, very bad move.
I think the bad thing about the U.S. decision in the United Nations Security Council was that it encouraged Hamas to take a hard line and to believe that international pressure will prevent Israel from freeing the hostages and destroying Hamas. And that, therefore, my decision not to send the delegation to Washington in the wake of that resolution was a message to Hamas. It was a message first and foremost to Hamas. Don't bet on this pressure, it's not going to work. And I hope they got the message.
Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant departed Washington today after concluding his meetings there with senior officials, including a sit-down with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who hosted Gallant at the Pentagon yesterday. Gallant calling their meeting an important discussion on operations required to destroy Hamas's governing and terror capabilities, efforts to release the hostages, and ways to ensure regional stability in the face of threats on multiple fronts. Taking a look now at our programming for tonight on JBS for Wednesday, March the 27th. At 7 o'clock, David Harris joins Shahar Azani to offer his perspective on failures of the West and the varied threats Israel is dealing with since October the 7th. At 7:30, Benjamin Anthony sits with Iris Haim, the mother of Yotam Haim, who was kidnapped by Hamas on October the 7th and tragically killed in a heartbreaking IDF operational miscalculation. At 9, Jason Gewurtz is on L'chaim. At 10, FIDF CEO Steve Weil speaks with leading scholar on the Middle East and theology of Islam, Mordechai Kedar, who talks about the trends in Sunni and Shia Islam and its ramifications for Israel and Western civilization today. At 10:30, an encore of this newscast, and coming up next, it's Thinking Out Loud. And that's the JBS News Update for Wednesday, March the 27th, 2024. I'm Teisha Bader. Am Yisrael Chai.